Welcome everyone to our next lesson. Today we're going to be talking about Alexander the Great and the process of Hellenization. And this takes place in the late 300s through the 200s, at least for today's lesson. The process of Hellenization actually ends around the time that Rome takes over the Mediterranean. So the process of Hellenization actually takes place for around 300 to 400 years. Which we're not going to be covering all of that today. We're just going to be covering the initial phases of it, of when it starts, what is Hellenism, and how it spreads throughout the world. Now, as we can see, here's a map of the Persian Empire outlined in red, the Kingdom of Macedon in the upper left-hand corner in green. And we can see within the Persian Empire there was formerly the Kingdom of Babylon, and we also see Persia proper. We also see that Cyrus made inroads to Pakistan, or it's modern-day Pakistan. It was known as India back then. Actually, Pakistan and India became two different countries only about 60 years ago, which most people are not familiar with. But as we can see, this is basically what Cyrus's empire looked like at this time. Now, Cyrus had been dead for a little while now, but he expanded the kingdom to around this size. It might have changed a little bit after he died, but this is basically what it looked like. And so when Alexander the Great came to town, came to many towns actually. By the way, Alexander was the king or emperor of Macedonia. Macedon is up in the upper left-hand corner in green. And what he did, as you can see in the map, he took the road south and then went through Asia Minor, went down through the land of Israel, around in Egypt, went back up into Babylon, through Persia, into India, and then made his way back home. Now, there's a curious policy that it might not be the most significant thing that we could cover. Excuse me. It might not be the most significant thing that we could be covering today, but I think that it is definitely pertinent to what we're covering and gives us some perspective. Now, when Alexander had come to Israel, he was actually received pretty well. His army came to town, and the Jewish leaders thought there's no way that we can oppose them. They outnumber us so much that we don't want people to die. We want to preserve life. This is actually the point of Torah for life, not for death. It's to live so that we shall not die, as it says in Deuteronomy 28 through 30, I believe. And so they concluded that it would be best to just give in as long as they could still continue practicing their religion. And so when Alexander comes to town, he says that this actually can happen, that the Jews can continue practicing biblical religion. They just have to politically submit to him. And they said, well, that's not so bad. We'll go along with that. And so Alexander actually offers sacrifices in the temple. And this is the beginning of positive relations with the Jews. As we covered last time, the Samaritans, when Alexander came to town, the Samaritans said, oh, we're Jews too. You can be nice to us too. And he says, yeah, you're not Jews. And there were some things that happened with them. But Alexander then goes down into Egypt and then proceeds to conquer the rest of the Persian Empire from there. And so, during this whole adventure that Alexander is going on, some Jews actually join his army. They are employed by Alexander the Great. And here is an account by Josephus. If you remember, Josephus is that ancient first century historian that lived during the first century and was contemporaneous with Paul. Paul and the rest of the apostles. He writes regarding Alexander's army and regarding the Jews in the army. He says, beyond all other people, the Jews will not renounce the religion of their forefathers. Other people had been renouncing their religions and basically becoming Greeks. they adopted Greek religion. Alexander was once at Babylon, the city of Babylon, and had an intention to rebuild the temple of Bel that was fallen to decay. And in order thereto, he commanded all his soldiers in general to brine earth together, or to brine earth there. But the Jews, and they only, would not comply with that command. Nay, they underwent stripes and great losses of what they had on this account, till the king forgave them and admitted them to live in quiet. So basically, he whipped them, and apparently some of their property was seized. But after that, everything was fine, and they weren't held accountable to building pagan temples. At least at that moment. When the Macedonians came to them, remember Alexander's the king or the emperor of Macedon. When the Macedonians came to them in that country and demolished the temples and the altars, they assisted them in demolishing them all. But, for not assisting them in rebuilding the temples, they either underwent losses or sometimes obtained forgiveness. So basically, the Jews that were part of Alexander the Great's army, they would help to destroy the pagan temples, but they would never help refurnish, rebuild, or build these pagan temples. And this is part of what biblical religion is. You are to have nothing to do with paganism. You can tear it down, but you can't uphold it. You can't build it, nor can you build on it. So what we come to, because Alexander the Great, he's an extraordinarily important person, but for today's lesson, it suffices for us to cover him but briefly. So we come to Alexander the Great's death. By 323 BCE, Alexander suddenly dies by somebody either poisons his food or he contracts some kind of disease like typhoid or malaria in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. And why we don't know how he died is because there are conflicting reports of his death. Nobody can get the facts straight. So, us moderns, or we moderns, don't really know how he died. One of the most famous people in history, we don't know how he died. It's believed that he more likely contracted some kind of disease. Although poisoning is certainly an option. So I like to joke with people and say the most powerful man in the world at that time caught a cold and died. So when Alexander was conquering the known world, caught a cold and died, this began the process of Hellenization. And from the point in which he died, the year 323 BC, to the year 280, which is roughly 40 years, this was the time period of the Wars of the Diadochi, which means successors in Greek. Basically, they were Alexander's friends, his generals that were working for him, who they started debating who was going to rule this enormous kingdom that Alexander had just conquered yesterday. And naturally, they did not talk this out. They decided, well, my guns are bigger than your guns. We're going to duke it out and see who comes out on top, if anybody comes out at all. So this began the Wars of the Diadochi. Alexander's generals basically waited until Alexander's pregnant wife, Roxana, who she was pregnant while Alexander was still alive, so it was Alexander's legitimate son, Alexander Jr. They waited until Roxana gave birth so that a successor could be born. Iridaeus, who was close with Alexander, he was, I don't want to call him Alexander's secretary, but he was a confidant, he was very close. He was named as co-ruler with Alexander Jr., Roxana's unborn child. But Iridaeus, being a full-grown military man versus an unborn child, in terms of who can most effectively run the kingdom, clearly we can see that Iridaeus would prevail. Now Perdiccas, Alexander's leading cavalry commander, is named regent of the empire. So basically we have president-elect Iridaeus, but we also have Perdiccas, who is helping to run the empire as well. In American political terminology, I don't know who he would be, but these guys are basically running the empire. Eventually, though, Perdiccas seizes control of the empire and appoints loyal generals as satraps, or governors. This term, I believe, is also used in the Bible. He appoints these satraps over various kingdoms within the empire. According to the book of Esther, I believe that there's 127 of these kingdoms, assuming that there's one kingdom per nation. And so there's a lot of kingdoms to be managed by these governors. These are extraordinarily powerful governors. Now, eventually, these are consolidated into 4 large kingdoms. At least 3 of them were large. One of them was fairly tiny, actually. We see that in the upper left hand of the map, we see that there's the kingdom of Cassander and the kingdom of Lysimachus. Now, eventually, I believe that Lysimachus defeats Cassander, and they merge kingdoms. He takes over, and then there's eventually 4. Now, this is precisely what the prophet Daniel predicts in his book. He says that a he-goat gallops across the earth. I believe he actually says he flies across the earth. That's how quickly he's going. His feet don't even touch the ground. And he takes over the known world in a matter of just a few years, basically. I think it's within a decade. But then suddenly, this shaggy he-goat is cut off, and his kingdom is divided into 4. And the 4 become 2, and the 2 become 1. And we see here the beginning of the fulfillment of prophecy. We have the 4 kingdoms here, and eventually these kingdoms become 2 kingdoms, and one of them is conquered by Rome, leaving 1 kingdom left, the kingdom of Seleucus. And Seleucus is naturally number 1. He's in the orange. We have Ptolemy down in the purple, Egypt. We have Antigonus up in Asia Minor, Syria, Israel, and Lebanon, and what is now northwestern Iraq, and all the way up to Byzantium. And then we have Lysimachus up in Macedon and Greece. So then what happens when all of these generals take over? They start implementing their policies. Well, the process of Hellenization. And as I like to emphatically declare, Hellenization changes everything. It changes everything. Just short of the moon and the sun. It changes much of what we know about civilization in parts of Europe, the Middle East, northeastern Africa, even all the way over into India and Pakistan. Hellenization changes everything. Well, that's great, but what is Hellenization? Hellenization was the process between 323 BC and 31 AD, basically the year that Yeshua died. It's the process of the spread of Greek philosophy, the spread, and that includes religion as well, Greek religion. It's the spread of Greek art and music, the spread of Greek math, architecture, military technology, and Greek science. It's the spread of Greek institutions and philosophy like democracy and gymnasiums and Olympic Games, those kind of things. It's the spread of Greek language and Greek literature. There's also Hellenistic syncretism, which basically means you keep your culture, but you accept ours as well. We fuse our cultures together. The two become one, basically. Where it's not purely Hellenistic culture, but it's not purely Egyptian culture, or purely Jewish culture, or purely Persian culture, or purely the culture of Asia Minor. or Asian culture. Mind you, in this course, when we're talking about Asians, we're talking about those living in Asia Minor, like the Galatians, for example. The Galatians lived in Asia. We're not talking about the entire continent of Asia from Turkey to China. Okay, we're talking about Asia Minor, which is that basically where Turkey and Armenia are today, in northern Syria. So we also see in this process of Hellenization the colonization of Greeks into places like Asia Minor and North Africa. So let's go down to our map. We see a plethora of examples of Hellenization. We see up in, if you take a look where the that golden comb is at the top of the screen, the top of the map, we see in Scythia, we see this golden comb. I believe it's a comb. And there is Greek art at the top of this comb. We see down in what's modern-day Jordan, in the now no longer inhabited city of Petra, we have enormous, intricate, not intricate, I can't think of the word. These very fascinating, well-produced Greek architectural themes right into the rock. And we see Greek statues, and it's basically a Hellenistic city in the side of a mountain, basically. We see in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, which, surprise, surprise, was founded by Alexander the Great, along with the other dozen Alexandrias. There's a number of Alexandrias in the Mediterranean world. We have the famous, one of the seven wonders of the world, the Library of Alexandria, which is a Hellenistic concept in and of itself, where we see this Hellenistic drive for knowledge and science and the accumulation of wisdom, which is basically what philosophy means. Philo, Sophia, the love of wisdom. Like Philadelphia, brotherly love, right? We see in Carthage, which I believe is modern-day Libya, we see the spread of Greek military technology and weapons up in there. We see in Egypt, Pharaoh Cleopatra, which I'm sure all of us have heard of Cleopatra, but the Cleopatra that we're thinking of is Cleopatra VII, who was Greek. We see the spread of Greek coinage, minted in places like Parthia and Bactria. And we also see Greek sculptures of the Buddha, or the one called the Buddha, in India and Pakistan, along with a frieze of the Trojan War, which you can see on the far right bottom of your screen. We see in Egypt the use of coins that bear Greek letters. So we see that Hellenism is affecting Greek Egyptian currency as well. And if I'm not mistaken, this is a picture of a woman on a loom who's probably creating textiles for blankets or clothes or something like that. We see here a Greco-Aramaic Zodiac, where Aramaic culture and Greek culture are basically becoming one. And as you can see, I believe that there's, let's lean in a little bit. I believe that there's Greek and Aramaic in this zodiac, which I would hope that you all know the zodiac is not biblical, but it was widespread throughout the world in some form. You ever been to a Chinese restaurant? There's the the year of the monkey, year of the tiger, year of the unicorn, or whatever. That's a zodiac. It's a form of the zodiac. We also see the Hellenization of the Indian language itself. If you want to, you can pause and look at this list. It's a pretty impressive list, where we see Greek words migrating into the Indian language, which is called Sanskrit at this time. which is especially significant because when a foreign culture changes a language, it starts to affect the way that you think. It changes the way that you see the world. It changes your perception of that foreign culture, or rather, it can. Not always, but it can. And so here's just a list of some of the words that went from Greek into Sanskrit. Sanskrit being the Indian language. Now we see here in the process of Greco-Indian Hellenization, we have this Bactrian kingdom in basically Pakistan, up there in the north. And we see the other Hindu cities in the southeast. We see there's a Hellenistic coin with Greek letters, and also it looks like some kind of Greek person on the front, but it's most likely the some kind of Hindu official that was drawn in a Hellenistic way, or perhaps it's the Greek leader of this Indo-Greek kingdom. We also see a Hellenistic version of Siddhartha Gautama, otherwise known as the Buddha. We see the nimbus around the head, the solar disk, the halo around the head. And we also see the how the clothes drape on the body. That's a very Hellenistic form of art. That's not native to India. We also see, if you look at the shape of the body, that's also very Greek. Then we see at the bottom a depiction of, I believe that's another depiction of the Trojan War. I'm not sure. But it's another example of Greek art basically infiltrating India. So as for literature, we see in Athens, Greece, that Athens becomes the home to many schools of rhetoric. Now, if somebody asks you a rhetorical question, what are they doing? They're basically asking you a question not for the purpose of gaining information or gaining an answer for that matter. They basically want to inspire the answer in your mind for the purpose of making a point, right? So, in this context, schools of rhetoric are basically schools where they teach you how to use logic. They teach you how to debate in a rational manner, so we're not just exploding emotionally on people or basically judging a book by its cover. It's a very scientific approach, and it's a very reasonable approach, something that I wish more people would do, honestly. Excuse me. Maybe not in this Hellenistic way, but if we learn how to use logic, I think that would be greatly beneficial for us. We also next come to the city of Alexandria in Egypt, which we briefly mentioned earlier. It was home to the Library of Alexandria, which was one of the classical 7 wonders of the world, and it's estimated to have had 700,000 scrolls, which we'll be talking about some of those a little later on. We also come to the city of Antioch, which as believers were familiar with when it comes to the book of Acts. Because in the book of Acts we know that the believers in Antioch were called Christians or Christianoi by the local pagans. Now what's especially interesting is that Antioch was this big hub of intellectuals and philosophers, and it was it can almost be likened to a college town, where there's a very intellectual atmosphere in the city, where you're more likely to discuss philosophy or science as opposed to a backwoods village where you're discussing seeds and rain and the quality of your sheep's manure. The city itself was founded about 300 years before Jesus was born by Seleucus I Nicator, which I believe is the Greek word for victor, the victorious, who was a general of Alexander. The city itself became very influential. Like I said, it became a very academic city, I guess you could call it. It also became one of the major centers of Hellenistic Judaism by the end of the 1st century AD, which, if you don't know what that is, then shame on you. I'm kidding, not shame on you. We'll be covering what Hellenistic Judaism is. We've not covered it. It's not very common knowledge. And you can read about it, of course, but it's not typically taught in Bible classes. Or if it is, it's discussed briefly, and then it's used to make a point. But anyways, it's this big place intellectually, both for pagans and even for Jews. You have an intellectual style of Judaism developed there. Doesn't mean that it's a correct style. It just means it's very cerebral. People, the Jewish philosopher Philo, for example, he uses some very, he sometimes uses very kind of Greek arguments to convince his Greek readers of the truth of the Bible. So to the Greek mind, that would seem very reasonable. To the Jewish mind, it would seem, kind of pointless. Now, there were also libraries built in not only Antioch, but Pergamon and Pella in Macedon, and the island of Rhodes. Now, speaking of libraries and the city of Alexandria, I'm sure that we all know about the Library of Alexandria, especially because I just mentioned it. And here's a depiction in the upper left-hand corner of what the library possibly looked like. We have an idea of what it looked like, but we don't really know because I believe it was Julius Caesar who accidentally burned it down. Now, I believe that there's also another library that's built either on or near that same location in modern-day Egypt. And there's a statue dedicated to Alexander the Great, because without him, this library would not have existed. So there's a dedication to him, as we can see. I don't know if you can see the people in the bottom of that picture, but assuming that they're, say, 5.5 feet tall, if you look at how big that monument is, that could easily be about 20 feet tall. So about 15, 20 feet tall. And the inscription says Alexander the Great, and it gives his birth and death dates there. We also see in the spread of the theater, the concept of the theater. Like I said, Greek institutions also spread. In the theater, we see that... Actually, let's begin in the upper left-hand corner. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a diagram of a theater that was discovered. I'm not exactly sure where, but this is just an example, where they were usually about half of a circle or about 3/4 of a circle. Then you can see the stage there. Now, the whole concept of a theater is Greek, and was usually used to promote Greek culture, Greek social values, Greek family values, Greek religious values, and so on. They are not really comparable to anything that we have today, but in terms of their impact, it might be comparable to American sitcoms, where they describe daily American life, but there are underlying themes, underlying values that are communicated. Now, not all of these presentations, these shows that were performed, not all of them were funny. Sometimes they were tragedies. Sometimes they were more action-based. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner, there's an actor that has masks. That's basically what those are. Those are not skulls. They're masks that he would have, and they were highly exaggerated so that the people up in the top row could see the emotion that being trying to be conveyed. That's why they look so ridiculous. But yeah, basically, sometimes the actors would carry the masks out on stage, and they'd switch masks in mid-performance, which I think is pretty funny. But that's just the way that they did things back then. And as we can see, the large bottom picture, is actually a real picture of a theater that they discovered. So, okay. Now the now the gymnasia or gymnasiums. Gymnasium is the Latin form. Gymnasion is the Greek, and it comes from the root word gymnos, which means naked. Of course, that's why we're all here, is to learn about this. I'm just kidding, by the way. Now, why this is relevant, we'll be getting to in just a moment. Men over 18 years old would receive sports training here. In fact, this is basically where our modern idea of sports comes from, is the concept of the gymnasion. Gymnasia is plural. It's like gyms. Gyms included also not only sports training, but also included public baths, or in today's lingo, they'd be like showers, a locker room. And they also included lectures on philosophy, literature, and music. Basically, the rationale was you exercise the body and you exercise the mind, which it's not a totally bad idea, as long as you leave your clothes on, right? I think that everybody involved would greatly appreciate that nowadays. But back then, nudity was much more accepted. It was much more common, and they as part of Greek religion, they saw there was some kind of reverence for naked human bodies. I wouldn't quite say there's a divine aspect, but there is. They thought there was something incredibly positive or good about naked people, whether you were attractive or not. They just thought the very fact that you were naked was a good thing, basically. Which I laugh because it's so bizarre. Public libraries were also usually nearby, at least for some of these. And what's interesting is that most modern day sports, like I said, originate in the gymnasia, including wrestling, boxing, Olympic Games kind of sports, and also ball games. They were funded and controlled by the government. And actually, in our book, In the Shadow of the Temple, when I say our book, I mean my book, actually. Let's see, on page 24, let's see if I can find page 24. Okie doke. I don't have these bookmarked. I'm sorry, 26. On page 26, the author is citing a passage from 1 Maccabees. And in 1 Maccabees, we'll be covering the context later, so don't worry about it. I'll be pointing out what's necessary for the lecture. But it says, these are Jews who are speaking, certain Jews. Let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This principle pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So basically, it's Jews who want to become Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, according to Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision, which is extraordinarily painful, by the way. Reversing your circumcision, it is possible. It's horrible, though. And they abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. This is in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 11 through 15. So if you notice, you have Jews that are basically apostatizing, They're becoming apostates, they're leaving biblical religion, and they're becoming pagan Greeks. They're going to the gyms where they would necessarily have to strip naked, and they get their circumcisions reversed. So basically what the circumcision is that you remove some of the skin in that area. What they would do is that they would take the skin and basically have an operation done where it looked like it was never done in the first place, but once that happens to you, you can't actually undo it. It would still look different. And to your typical Greek, having an uncircumcised part was very valued. And so for Jews who wanted to fit in among the pagans, who wanted to fit in with the world, they they would sometimes do this. Now, flipping to page 34 of the same book, let's see. Oscar Scarsana says, the naked young men training in the gymnasium were a flagrant contradiction of the Torah commandments prescribing decency. On the other hand, circumcision violated all Greek ideals. The Greeks thought it a mutilation of the body. The Sabbath rest and its reasons were unfathomable to the Greeks, and even more so the dietary laws, which to the Greek mind seemed entirely irrational. Basically sounds like today, right? You hear certain liberals saying that circumcision is evil. You'll occasionally hear about it in the news, in places like California, for example. And then you also see Christians saying that the Sabbath and the dietary laws are nonsense. They have nothing to do with what God wants, and they don't understand them. As Oscar Scarsona says, they're unfathomable. They just can't comprehend what they have to do with anything. So, if we flip over to our map in the next slide, there we go. I guess you can't flip without me. If we look at our map, we see in this map that there's some regions in bold there, like Persia, the land of Israel, which unfortunately is mistakenly called Palestine in this erroneous version. Asia Minor up in Turkey, and we also have Macedonia. As we can see with all of these little bullet points, just how great the extent of these gymnasia were. For example, we have one in, these are not the only examples, but they are just some examples to show us how widespread they were. Now remember, these things originated in Greece, in Macedon, which at this point were basically the same thing. We see one in Elis, Greece, and Sardis, Turkey, which, if I remember correctly, was there not a church of Sardis in Revelation? I think there might have been. Unfortunately, in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel, in Ombi, Egypt, in the city of Babylon, in Ai-Khanum, Bactria, which is now Afghanistan. And it was said of actually this particular one in Afghanistan, it has all the hallmarks of a Hellenistic city, with a Greek theater, gymnasium, and some Greek houses with colonnaded courtyards. We see that the Greeks were transplanting their cities all over the world. Hopefully we can begin to see the extent by which Hellenism was changing everything, was affecting everything. Now, after these wars, the Diadochi, the wars of the successors of Alexander, between the years 301 and 219 BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled in Egypt, the territory of Egypt went up into the land of Judea. And from 283 to 246, so the middle of the 200s BC, the early to middle 200s, we find this character Ptolemy II Philadelphus, which, as I said earlier, philosophia, philosophy, is the love of wisdom. Philadelphos, or Philadelphus, is the city of brotherly love. So Ptolemy II Philadelphus is the one who loves his brother, basically. I guess he was trying to come off as a very friendly guy. He loves everyone. Whether he did or not is perhaps a different story. But but that's irrelevant for our purposes today. Why he's important for today's lesson is that he commissioned the translation of the Torah into Greek for the first time. And this is for the purpose, this is the Septuagint, if you've ever heard of the Septuagint. He commissions the Torah to be translated into Greek for inclusion at the Library of Alexandria. So basically, Alexander takes over the world, catches a cold and dies. Hellenism spreads everywhere. The Library of Alexandria pops up, and the Pharaoh Ptolemy II, who is a Greek ruling in Egypt, he commissioned the Torah, a Jewish book, to be translated into Greek to put in the Library of Alexandria. It's amazing how these things all work out and how it all happens. Now, legend says that about 70 elders, either 70 or 72, translated the Torah, and their translations were all the same. And eventually, after this time, the entire Tanakh, the entire Old Testament, was also translated. Now, here's a passage from Josephus. Again, we covered who Josephus is. In his book, Antiquities of the Jews, he says, when once Ptolemy asked him how many tens of thousands of books he had already, about 20 times 10,000, which I believe is 200,000 books, or scrolls, but that in a little time he should have 50 times 10,000, or 500,000. He should have twice that much, or 2.5 times as much, I think. But he said he had been informed that there were many books of laws among the Jews worthy of inquiry after, and worthy of the king's library, but which were written in characters and in a dialect of their own, will cause no small pains in getting them translated into the Greek language. So basically, we'd love to have your books, but we can't read them. They're not in Greek. They're not in a language that we understand. So the king thought that Demetrius was very zealous to procure him abundance of books, and that he suggested what was exceedingly proper for him to do. And therefore he wrote to the Jewish high priest that he should act accordingly. So basically, long story short, Ptolemy, the Greek pharaoh in Egypt, sends word to the Jewish high priest, which at the time the high priest was basically acting as the prince of Judea. He couldn't technically be king, but he could still be the ruler, kind of, in a sense, maybe, somewhat. Now, it took almost 100 years to fully translate the entire Septuagint. The Septuagint being the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. Which, if we remember, Tanakh stands for what? Torah, the law, Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings, or the scriptures. Now, we're almost done. In the year 198 BCE, we have Antiochus III, and he conquers the land of Israel. He conquers Judea from Ptolemy. Antiochus is up in Syria, so let's go back to our map and see who would be ruling at that time. It would have been Antigonus. Antigonus was probably dead at this point, almost assuredly. It would have been about 100 or so years. But this kingdom, the kingdom of Antigonus, that area, as we see in green, is where we're talking about. And as we can see, the green stretches down right up until Ptolemy's Egypt, and then it stops. And that leg that sticks down is Judea, Lebanon, and Syria. So, Antiochus III conquers Judea in 198 BCE, and at this time the temple had fallen into disrepair. And actually, interestingly enough, Antiochus III helps to repair the temple, and he gives tribute to the temple. A Greek king is coming to the temple and helping to repair it. It's similar to how Cyrus helps to finance the rebuilding of the temple and helps to provide resources and security forces in the form of troops to escort the Jews back home. Now, this is not the case with his son, cleverly named also Antiochus. Antiochus IV, so-called Epiphanes. I say so-called because Epiphanes basically means God in the flesh or God manifest. Why is this? Well, we have the bullet points to explain why. Antiochus IV tries to invade Egypt, but he fails. And so he comes home, and as he's coming through Judea, the Jews in the land of Israel resist Antiochus IV's rule. Now, if we remember, his daddy, the third, was... excuse me. Let's see. Okay. So, Antiochus IV comes back into Judea, and the Jews resist his rule. And so, in 169 BCE, Antiochus IV invades and sacks, or tries to destroy, the city of Jerusalem. He burns some of it, destroys some of it, and unfortunately, he also loots the temple. He steals from the treasury of the temple. He robs the temple. And he bans Jewish practices. Now, this is just the last straw for some Jews who want to stay faithful to God, who want nothing to do with the evil Hellenists and the spread of their pagan religion, their naked gymnasiums, and their propagandistic pagan theaters. We have someone such as Yehuda Maccabi, or Judah Maccabee, and his followers. We see that, what's his name? His father, I'm drawing a blank here, but his father actually begins the revolt and he soon dies, but the revolt is picked up by Yehuda Maccabee, and he leads the Jews to an all-out war against Antiochus IV and the Hellenistic Greek kingdom that he rules. So, what eventually happens? The Jews win. Imagine that. The forces of good prevail. Biblical religion prevails. God prevails. And the revolt against the pagan Greeks succeeds. This was not only a revolt against Greek rule, but it was a revolt against Hellenism as well. And then from around 140 to the year 37 BCE, we see the establishment of a Jewish kingdom. And for much of that time, it was an independent Jewish kingdom, but in the 60s BC, Rome comes in and takes over. And then for a few decades, they allow Jewish kings to continue, but then they quit after that because they see that it's not going to work out too well for their purposes. So, in conclusion, I know we covered a lot today, but here is the gist of what we should take away from today's lesson. We find that Alexander the Great conquered the known world and spread his native culture, and this process is called Hellenism. Hellenism was syncretic, which means it tried to attach itself to and infiltrate existing cultures, and it fused with these cultures. So basically it said, you can keep your religion, you can keep your language, you can keep your culture, as long as you accept us too. We don't mind that you're having a party of your own, as long as you invite us. But eventually what happened is that when Greek rulers came to power, they forced this process of Hellenization, which basically the existing cultures of those time fell out of favor. They just became less popular, and they were suppressed by the government, and eventually you start seeing all of these cultures that all had their unique practices and languages and foods and such. They were being replaced by this large, overarching macro culture, so to speak, called Hellenism. Eventually, as we will be covering later, in one of the next lessons, the Jews eventually revolt against Hellenism, and this caused the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus IV, the so-called God in the flesh, Epiphanes. Which I find that kind of ironic that they were revolting against this person. But we'll be getting into that later, which will probably be giving you more details than you could ever want. But but at least you'll have them at your disposal. You can remember them if you want, and if not, then you can make space in your brain for other things. So that is the end of today's lesson. I'm glad we kept this relatively short again. And I'm hoping to try to keep these to about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. That's basically what we did today. So I hope that this was beneficial for you. I hope that maybe you can start to see how some of the pieces of the puzzle are falling into place. If not, that is entirely okay, because we'll be covering much more in the preceding lessons. So may you all be blessed. May you have an excellent week. Do good to one another, and be in peace.